There are roughly 1.3 billion Han Chinese in the world, about 20% of the entire global population and the largest ethnic group in the world by far. The Arabs at 360 million and the Bengalis 140 million trail far, far behind. The Han Chinese population, in fact, is larger than the next five ethnic groups combined. The interesting thing about that 1.3 billion is that the vast majority of them reside in a single country, the People's Republic of China. China is 92% Han Chinese for a count of 1.26 billion. The next largest Han population center is the Republic of China in Taiwan with 22 million, and Thailand after that with 9 million. But Thailand is majority Thai, so if you want to look at Han Chinese majorities, then you have China, the ROC, and the areas of Hong Kong and Macau, usually grouped together for political sensitivity purposes into Greater China. And then we usually roll in Singapore, the one single Han majority country outside the Greater China area, to create something that I have read people call the Sinosphere. None of this includes the minority Han people who reside in America, Europe, etc., of which there are so few that they're basically a rounding error. The geographic location of China served as one of the several cradles of civilization where anthropologists theorized that civilization independently developed. That they began as the Huaxia tribes along the Yellow River, which then expanded into southern China. The word Hua itself remains in use today within both the PRC and the ROC. Some Taiwanese refer to themselves as Huaren in order to circumvent the politics of calling themselves Chinese or Zhongguo. This is usually where you would do some sort of funny or interesting anecdotes about what 1.3 billion people means and how long will it take you to shake hands with all of them, for example. And I was originally planning for that. But there were a few other questions about the Han Chinese topic that I was curious about answering. And that led to the rest of this video here. When my Chinese friends take genetic ancestry tests like those offered by 23andMe, they're frustratingly revealed to be nothing more than just Chinese. Nothing more than that, while people who were white would get tantalizingly detailed results that would say that they were 40% Welsh, 20% Belgian, and 10% cat. Just kidding. The joke that we like to make was that, well, that narrows it down to about a billion. Before, we would think that this sort of result was a result of being racially underrepresented in the reference gene pool that the genetic testing service uses, and perhaps that could be true. But at the same time, part of the reason your genetic tests say so little more than just Chinese is that the Han population is remarkably genetically homogeneous. According to a study done in 2009, as well as another in 2004 on some 1,500 Han samples spread across China, Taiwan, and the overseas areas, there are far fewer genetic variations between two different Han people than what you would expect in a population that large. Let us take Europeans, for example. Altogether, the entire European ethnicity is found to be much more genetically varied, having a difference of 0.009 as versus 0.002 in the Han Chinese ethnicity, despite living in a much smaller space. For the Chinese, you basically have two genetic subgroups, North Han and South Han, generally split by the mighty Yangtze River. The subgroups are not prominent enough to justify a genetic split, though you get plenty of stereotypes about how northern and southern Chinese are, but they are there. The closest non-Han genetic group that was studied were the Japanese, who are somewhat closely related but have much more in common with the northern Chinese. Part of the reason for this remarkable genetic homogeneity is the fact that the Han migrated quite often. Beyond the normal geographic moves that people within populations make over the centuries, there have been identified at least 3 major migrations that the Han Chinese people have made over the past 2,000 years. These migrations are generally tied to geopolitical issues such as the rise and fall of dynasties, the Han and Tang dynasties, for example, as well as the standard motivators of war and famine. Not only with their migrations, their marriages make any sort of certain ancestry identification extremely difficult, and is quoted by the papers, virtually impossible. There are no neat lines of familiar descent, and it looks more like spaghetti. I do want to address here a potential misconception. I am not saying that the Chinese have descended from 5,000 years ago in a quote-unquote pure state. Han Chinese people have blended in with many different peoples that they have assimilated over the years, especially as they have migrated over their lands. However, my point is that rather than having those people staying in one place and growing into an individual population, they got up and moved, homogenizing the population as a whole. Reading about this Chinese shared culture and language, I'm reminded of a joke I saw on Dave Chappelle's Netflix special. I laughed at that, but at the same time, he brought up an interesting point. How did the Han Chinese population grow so fast, and why is everyone in China Chinese? By the way, it might be tempting to dismiss China's ethnic minorities, the 8%, as being basically negligible, but that population is itself massive, 112 million, mostly made up of the Zhuang people, 18 million, the Manchu people, about 15 million, and also the former rulers of the Qing dynasty, the Hui people, 10 million, and so on. If, in fact, China's ethnic minority population by itself were its own country, then it would be larger than the Philippines or Egypt as of 2017. And to give a sense of that scale, Egypt, with 97 million people, is the third largest or most populous country in Africa. So back to the concept of population growth. Between the 1250 and 1850, China grew from 100 million people to 450 million people. And in order for such a thing to happen, society has to grow an immense amount of food to avoid population destroying famines, conflict, and wars, as well as support growing healthy families. The rough consensus as to why this growth came about is a result of several geographical advantages as well as innovations in food and agricultural production. Even as the population exploded throughout the Ming dynasty, at that time 120 million to 150 million in 1620, and the Qing dynasty, which grew to a population, which recorded a population 350 million in 1800. Agricultural advances within society allowed the population to stay content, fed, and content throughout the entire through these centuries. Two of the major innovations include the introduction of new crops such as fast ripening rice from Indochina, as well as soy-based fertilizers introduced from the Chinese north that were far superior to the currently available poop-based fertilizers. The third innovation has nothing to do with technology, but instead economics. The final piece of the food and growth engine fell into place when the Qing dynasty took over from the Ming dynasty. And one of the first things that the Qing dynasty did was land reform, instituting new taxes on large landowners and breaking up their holdings. As a result, people could de facto own the land they farmed on, and because they now essentially get to reap the profits from the land that they now own, a new technique emerged known as double cropping, which allowed peasants to plant twice in a year, first rice and then wheat, doubling the yield they got from their land. People worked slightly harder, but they got twice the yield of foods from their land. With this, farmers were able to make more food for their population, more food for their population than ever before. Combined with a river basin that is generally flat and conducive for migration and land wars, and you have a constantly intermixing, homogenizing Han population, think of it as a piece of dough in which you're folding in more flour and egg constantly over time. New ingredients come in and you knead the whole thing over, turning it over and over. The result is a Han Chinese population, immense and genetically similar on a genetic and cultural level. The second part of the question that I asked earlier, why is everyone in China Chinese? What I mean by that, why is the Chinese nation so unified? The answer to that is in a future video, but part of the answer is, well, it actually has not been all that unified. So until that next time, have a good one.